Hi, it's James with Cowboy 43 Productions here, and I'm making another video where I share some of my thoughts on atheism, part 4. Alright, so for the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about how science and atheism really seem to go hand in hand. So I ended up mentioning in my last video that one of the more talked about arguments against God deals with just science and new scientific discoveries. And science itself probably wouldn't be a big argument against God because God is spectacular. But many of your theist groups have theology and creation accounts that, when taken literally, do not always fit perfectly with science and new scientific discoveries, just because science is such a broad field. It's not as simple as, a couple lines of dialogue in the Bible or something. It's been pointed out recently that many of your theist groups have been known for being anti-science or even practicing false science. And in the United States especially, science literacy rates are statistically low. So we're at this crossroads in the United States where many people tend to think that science and atheism are very interconnected with each other. You can't believe in science and still get saved by Jesus. I remember one time I had a pastor indicate to me that I could either believe in the Bible or believe in science. I couldn't believe in both in any way. I would push back against that argument that science and atheism are exclusive to each other. Throughout history, there have been plenty of scientists who have come from different faith backgrounds, and they've still been able to practice science even though they maintain their faith. And then again, there are other scientists such as Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, and Steven Weinberg, who are more your militant atheists. These atheists, along with others, tend to discuss the wonders of science, but also eliminate God as a possibility. So these atheists are well known as militant, as they have a history of publicly speaking against religion and belief in God for various reasons. These atheists tend to be very vocal and say that religion has no place in society. So why are other scientists atheists? So in a YouTube presentation by the Veritas Forum titled, "Why Are Many Scientists Atheists?" scientist Tom Rudelis says that for most of his colleagues, the answer is based on their upbringing and their general knowledge. Rudelis tells us,
for the most part, atheists tend to view the world as a mathematical structure, whereas theists tend to view the world as a story. Neither of these is better than the other, because certainly our universe has aspects of both.
So Rudelis then asks, who is the storyteller? Is it God, or is it us?
On the other hand, I can't think, at least off the top of my head, of any mathematical structure that gives rise to a world full of intelligent beings with the illusion of time flowing past, where people interact and seem to have moral choices and judgments to make.
I remember just growing up and going to public school. So we studied U.S. history, but we also studied global history. And then I remember we took chemistry and biology and physics, and they really tried to educate us and give us a complete picture of the scientific landscape and how science works. From an early age, we learned about the dinosaurs and how the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and then the dinosaurs were wiped out long before man. And we learned about early man, cavemen, for example, and we learned about the fundamentals of evolution and just how that relates to biology and us, a key picture of who we are. So understandably, for me as a kid growing up, I didn't grow up in the church necessarily, and so it was a little bit confusing to me as I started attending church youth group in middle school and high school. And eventually the church leaders, they started talking about science and how science works. Often at church, the church leaders were very dismissive of science and the dinosaurs. And the church tried to just lump all of history into this 6,000 to 10,000 year window involving Noah's Ark and a global flood and just all these different elements. And it was confusing. And I'm probably still confused by all these things to this day. It's not that I'm a bad theist or anything. I think I just see that something doesn't quite make sense. And as I've had, discussions with church pastors or even other theists, I've always just felt very alone on the issue. The church pastor would give me an answer that's approved by the church, and then the kids in church or whatever, they'd give me an answer that was approved by the church. So as I've gone and I've looked at deconstruction, I have found many kids grow up in the church and they say their faith began to really unravel as they went off to college and began to learn about the age of the earth along with the evidence for evolution. It's just a similar story every time, and I will really do my best to elaborate, but I could really use some help. As far as scientists can gather, the early universe was in a hot, dense state, and then some unknown circumstance caused the early universe to begin expanding outward exponentially in all directions. Scientists have called this the Big Bang Theory, but according to scientist Diana, who hosts the YouTube series Physics Girl,
the initial singularity, which is when everything in the early universe would have been just like all compacted into a singular point where the laws of physics break down, infinite mass. Are you aware that that's an outdated idea?
The theory is best described as the Great Expansion Theory.
Yeah, is that the Big Bang happened everywhere, and it was.
In a YouTube presentation on the universe, atheist Aaron Ra supports this notion, saying,
"Otherwise, logically, we can't get something from nothing, right? So something must be eternal without a beginning, and it could be the matter and energy of this universe."
Ra then goes on to bash the Judeo-Christian God as an unlikely explanation. PatrickGrant.com gives a time frame for the early universe, which is measured in seconds and involves space, time, matter, and energy. According to Grant, our universe is in a closed system, meaning the elements created during the formation of the early universe, along with the laws of physics, may have acted differently then. But, according to the laws of conservation of mass and energy, nothing new has been created or destroyed in a closed system. In a YouTube presentation titled, "What Came Before the Big Bang?", researcher Arvin Ash discusses the early universe on a quantum level. So according to Ash, there is a process known as quantum tunneling, where a zero-sized universe tunnels through an energy barrier and becomes a finite-sized universe.
This would have happened for a very short time, a tiny fraction of a second, because this repulsive force quickly decays into an attractive force of gravity that we see today. But this short period of time is enough to cause the bang in the Big Bang. And what triggered all this? Well, in quantum physics, events do not necessarily have a cause, just some probability. So there is some probability for the universe to pop out of nothing. You might say, well, even if we bind to all that, you're still not starting with nothing because you have to start with the laws of quantum mechanics. This is not nothing. This is definitely something. Where did these laws come from? Why do we have these laws? Do they exist independent of space and time? So far, nobody has answers to this question. So this may be the ultimate question for humanity. Could it be that these laws exist regardless of whether the universe exists? Maybe like 2 + 2 is 4 will exist regardless of whether any humans are around or whether any universe is around?
In an episode of Closer to Truth titled, "Why Did the Universe Begin?", scientist Sir Roger Penrose backs the idea that there were special conditions and that the early universe did not know how to tell time.
And that's this maximum random state, maximum entropy state, we say. Something special about that was in the gravity. What you're not looking at is gravity. And the thing is that the universe was very, very uniform in the early days. And we think of uniform as being consistent with being random, if you like. But that's not true when gravity is the principal ingredient, because it tends to clump things together. The sun is out there, for instance, because it's clumped together out of a previously uniform distribution of gas. And that sun gets hot. Background sky is cold. The sun is hot. And it's the difference between the hot sun and the cold sky that we live off. And that's where all life comes from that. So the universe was very special, but it was very special only in the gravity. Somehow gravity wasn't thermalized with everything else. And that's something which needs to be explained. To me, it's the greatest puzzle about the Big Bang. Now, I don't see most of these theories making any attempt to answer that question. Certainly the inflationary model doesn't. It only, in a certain sense, makes things worse. And the argument is that it smooths out the universe and things like this, but it doesn't do that unless you're already special, or even more special in the early stages.
In a TED Talk titled, "Why Does the Universe Exist?" scientist Jim Holt says he appreciates his atheist colleagues, but he avoids using the term laws of physics, as the term law is too close, in his opinion, to theist terminology, and it implies that physics is backed by something. Holt says he prefers the term patterns of physics to best describe the strange, unknown, mediocre puzzle of a universe we see around us.
Now, reality has to turn out some way. It can either turn out to be nothing or everything or something in between. So if it has some special feature, like being really elegant or really full or really simple, like nothingness, that would require an explanation. But if it's just one of these random generic realities, there's no further explanation for it. And indeed, I would say that's the reality we live in. That's what science is telling us. That's what...
Continuing with Grant's article, the universe continues to expand, and as it cools, dense pockets of gas form in space, called nebulas. Bright stars form in the nebulas and get dispersed across space. In a YouTube presentation on star and galaxy formation in the early universe, Professor Dave explains that stars form with planets in orbit and groups of stars form into galaxies. In short, because massive stars exert gravity on one another.
To imagine a star as a gigantic gas cloud that collapsed on itself with such tremendous gravitational force that it heated up until it became a spherical furnace of plasma, a hot soup of nucleons and electrons whizzing around. So we've gone from tiny atoms scattered around the universe to huge stars, burning hydrogen fuel and glowing like fireflies. What happened next? Well, the key factor will continue to be gravity, as will be the case throughout our astronomical journey. This same period of time that accounts for star formation is also when the first galaxies began to form.
In a YouTube presentation titled, "Where Do Galaxies Come From?", the author Minute Physics explains how cosmic events take a long time to occur. But since our solar system is surrounded by so many stars and galaxies in different stages, we can piece together an understanding of how these events occur.
What we do know is that today we have bajillions of galaxies in our universe, none of which existed 13.8 billion years ago, so somewhere in between, they must have all been babies.
Continuing with Grant's article, our sun was born, and a hot, uninhabitable Earth formed around 5 billion years ago. Then, the Earth was able to cool enough for an atmosphere to develop, and basic microbial life develops in underwater volcanic environments. Later on, the oceans were filled with an abundance of fish, and the earliest mammals and birds were around by 200 million years ago. According to an article by World Atlas titled, "The First Animals to Walk on Land," the first fossils of creatures that could walk on land were found in Scotland, and these are known as tetrapods. This transition from sea to land is believed to have occurred around 360 million years ago. You know, I recall learning in science class, the dinosaurs walked the earth long ago. They were a series of reptilian and bird-like creatures of all shapes and sizes, some big and some small. So, according to Grant, around 65 million years ago, a large asteroid slammed into the northern Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and the impact stirred up enough heat and dust in the atmosphere to bring an end to most of life on Earth.
When measuring the age of dinosaur fossils, scientists noticed that they stopped appearing at a particular moment in history, meaning that most dinosaurs died simultaneously. In other words, geological evidence showed that 66 million years ago, a sudden mass extinction caused the end of the Cretaceous period and the Mesozoic era, giving rise to the Paleogene, the first period of the Cenozoic era, which continues to this day. This mysterious mass extinction was cataloged as the KPG event, which means Cretaceous Paleogene. In the geological record, the KPG event is marked by a thin layer of sediment called the KPG boundary, which can be found worldwide in marine and terrestrial rocks. Strangely, this clay that marks the KPG boundary shows unusual high levels of metallic iridium, an element more common in asteroids than in the Earth's crust.
According to an Our World in Data article by author Hannah Ritchie, there have been at least 5 mass extinction events in Earth's past, and this was only the latest one. We learned in science class that birds and fish are technically still dinosaurs. If the dinosaurs hadn't died out, the dinosaurs were so vast and so dangerous, the mammals would not have been able to flourish. You can actually read a little bit more about the dinosaurs in the book The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Dinosaurs by J. Stevenson and George McGee. As Grant points out, by 600,000 years ago, the earliest ancestors to Homo sapiens began to appear throughout Africa and even outside of Africa. In a YouTube presentation on the origins of Homo sapiens, Professor Chris Stringer looks at ancient human origins. He points out there were many groups of early man who left Africa, but Homo sapiens, as we are today, first began to appear around 200,000 years ago and left Africa around 60,000 years ago and met other Homo species like Neanderthals, and there was interbreeding between the two groups, and possibly others. Stringer notes that scientists know this not only because we find the bones of cavemen, but also because we can trace our origins through our DNA.
What we see now from the fossil evidence is a great diversity. At every level where we've got good evidence, we see there are a number of species coexisting. It's as though nature's experimenting in how to be human with all these different lineages. And so even 70,000 years ago, which is like yesterday geologically speaking, there were at least 5 kinds of humans around on the Earth. So we were evolving in Africa and starting to emerge from there. The Neanderthals, they were evolving in Europe and Asia. Over in East Asia, we had these Denisovans, who we know about mostly from their DNA.
Other sources will note that there were potentially a number of Homo species alive, but by around 15,000 years ago, the last Homo cousin died out. We, as Homo sapiens, are the only ones left. You can actually read more about this in the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Alright, so how do we know that the Earth is old? In a Forbes article titled, How Do We Know the Earth is 4.5 Billion Years Old?, author C. Stuart Hardwick says this age is arrived at through multiple means, and that science has further elaborated on this topic. According to Hardwick, the 6,000-year age came about in the 16 and 1700s, when Archbishop James Ussher made an attempt to trace back the lineage of Jesus in the Bible to Adam, and he came up with an exact estimate. Hardwick notes, as Hebrew scholar William Green later wrote on the topic, Ussher came to this estimate and ignored several variables. Green felt the scriptures only accurately brought us back to the time that Abraham lived. As Hardwick notes, many young Earth creationists have had to push the number back to 12,000 years, as science has shown that the age of a tree is shown in the number of rings found across its trunk, and research has shown that scientists have found some pretty old trees. Hardwick also looks at ice cores in the Arctic. The frozen layers act as a time capsule the further down you go. So theoretically, we could unearth something in the Arctic that has been frozen for 1 billion years, and that could pose a threat to the global ecosystem. Hardwick also looks at large areas such as the Grand Canyon in Arizona, where there are a diversity of rock layers spanning ages. In an article by Space.com titled, How Old is the Earth?, author Nola Tillman tells us it has been a process for scientists to figure out the age of the Earth, as measuring changes in sea levels, or with changes in temperature, have proven unreliable, and the gradual shifting of Earth's plates has caused land masses to get recycled over time. As other sources will note, typically carbon dating works well up to 30,000 years or so, but more recent advancements have allowed scientists to measure the age of much older objects. As Tillman explains, scientists can now use the process of radiometric dating to show how isotopes of radioactive elements decay into other elements at a predictable rate. Tillman says, By examining the existing elements, scientists can calculate the initial quantity of a radioactive element, and thus how long it took for the elements to decay, allowing them to determine the age of the rock. Tillman looks at several locations on Earth where scientists have found the oldest rocks which are terrestrial or native to Earth, such as a group of rocks in Australia dating back to around 4.3 billion years ago. Tillman says scientists have also found stardust along with meteors from outer space that have crashed on Earth, which are older than this. You can actually read more about this in the book The Story of Earth by Robert Hazen. Alright, so here we go. What about all these arguments over the theory of evolution?
The first thing that started leading me down my path of deconstruction was learning about the science of evolution.
I began having doubts. I stopped believing in creationism and accepted evolution.
I'm like, oh no, these answers are terrible. So then it was like, okay, maybe I should go research what do the best evolutionists think.
So it's pretty typical whenever someone discusses evolution, they segue into a reference to Charles Darwin. In a YouTube presentation titled Charles Darwin, Evolution and Religion by Biographics, creator Simon Whistler discusses how Darwin was an average student who grew up in a Unitarian Christian household. Darwin went to university for theology, but he got involved in a club studying naturalist thought. Whistler tells us Darwin later went on a group expedition along the coast of South America and the neighboring islands, where he studied the interesting variations in species that he encountered. Whistler tells us Darwin spent the next 30 years discussing his findings among his colleagues in the science community, and many of them shared his views.
People, they were indeed outraged. Darwin was denying the truth that was in the Bible. Scientists lined up to have their say, with many criticizing Darwin. One clergyman called the quiet, mild-mannered Darwin the most dangerous man in England. But others quickly recognized the good science in Darwin's ideas and the vast amount of evidence which supported them.
In a TED Talk on debunking myths about evolution, scientist John Van Wy says by the time Darwin published his theory in 1859, the science community was aware the Earth was not flat, for example, but fossils and rock layers caused them to suspect the Earth was most likely quite old.
The scientific community before Darwin, all religious men, not evolutionists, not atheists, had already figured out in preceding decades that the Earth is unbelievably ancient. So these 2 points are universally accepted before Darwin, that the world is unbelievably ancient and that the history of life on Earth has been a progressive story.
Wy mentions that things weren't easy for Darwin at first, but by the 1870s, the debate was over amongst the science community. This is where your philosophers mention how the atheist community thought religion would have died out after this period of time, not experience revivals in belief. Darwin started out as a theology student, and he came up with a philosophy of evolution. He believed in a god of naturalism. You can actually read more about this in the book The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. In a YouTube presentation on How Evolution Works by PBS Eons, host Callie explains how Charles Darwin and fellow researcher Alfred Wallace both did their own research and came to similar conclusions.
In a population of living things, natural variations will occur. And as a result of those changes, some members of the population will survive and reproduce more than others. Those that survived and reproduced will pass on their traits to their offspring. And this meant that traits that give an individual an advantage in a certain environment will get passed on more often.
Their work was later elaborated upon, as the science community later learned about microevolution, which involves small adaptations over time, as well as macroevolution, where species will go through so many adaptations that they diverge and become separate species.
And for generating the diversity that we see in the fossil record as well as in modern ecosystems. It's the very foundation of our understanding of biology, and it continues to help us make sense of the world around us.
In a YouTube presentation on What is the Evidence for Evolution by Stated Clearly, creator John looks at how life on Earth is biologically related by common ancestry. John describes life by comparing it to a tree with many branches, splitting off in all directions. John looks at a complex genetic sequence called DNA as being a crucial building block for life. Since all life shares DNA, we know that some species are more closely related than others through common ancestry.
DNA molecules contain chemical codes which act like recipes for living things. Researchers can compare the DNA code of different living creatures to find out who is most closely related to who. Whale DNA has been compared to all kinds of other animals, fish, sea lions, you name it. And so far, the closest genetic match is to the pudgy, water-loving hippopotamus. This does not mean that whales evolved from hippos, but if this genetic finding is correct, whales and hippos both evolved from a common ancestor that lived roughly 54 million years ago.
Scientists then have the unique ability to look at the vast fossil record and have found intermediate fossils, which show transitions between species. In a YouTube presentation on the longest-running evolution experiment by Veritasium, creator Derek interviews Professor Richard Lenski, who tells us he has been running a lab experiment involving bacteria for the past 30 years. Lenski details how his team has been able to allow the bacteria to adapt to different conditions in a controlled environment. Lenski says his team has seen the bacteria go through millions of generations, and the bacteria have become more and more fit over time. Lenski says the team knows the adaptations are authentic as the team holds on to older generations kept frozen in stasis as a scientific constant. So having the scientific constant is useful because it allows the scientists to look at the older generation and then compare that to the newer generation and just see how the generations have changed.
And to me, that's kind of profound, and it's sort of changed the way I look at this experiment and even a little bit how I look at life on Earth. Life on Earth doesn't stop evolving. We know that, and we know that, but we think that's because they're asteroid impacts. That's because of human impacts. That's because they're viruses that are attacking their hosts. The coevolution is causing evolution to never stop. The world is always changing, and that is 100% true. But what our experiment suggests is that even in the absence of environmental change, there are so many opportunities of smaller and smaller magnitude to continue to make progress that, in fact, progress probably would never stop, even in a constant environment. To me, it's one of the reasons to keep this experiment going. Does this model continue to predict the unfolding of the future fitness trajectory?
You can actually read more about evolution in the book Darwin's Ghost, an update by Steve Jones. Alright, so this is a really big question. So what is the origin of life? Yeah, so those involved will tell you that obviously the age of the Earth, along with the evidence for evolution, these are typically favorite topics among atheists, as these go way beyond the concepts in the Bible, and for the most part it scares people.
The evolutionary process, the process that Darwin discovered, didn't start from nothing. It had to start from a reasonably complicated chemical beginning, which was the first self-replicating molecule. Natural selection can't get going until you have genetics, and so you've got to have genetics. And that's not a trivial problem, and it's a problem that actually hasn't yet been solved.
Actually, that's kind of interesting, because it's true that many people think that evolution has to do with the origin of life, but it's really the origin of the diversity of life.
You have to start from a genetics, and that's one of the big gaps in our knowledge at the moment. Nobody knows how that started. The laws of chemistry somehow had to give rise to a self-replicating molecule. Once you've got that, then evolution takes off.
We certainly know about life on Earth, but in a TED Talk titled "Where Are All the Aliens?", scientist Stephen Webb discusses the search for life in the universe in terms of the barriers that life would have to overcome. Webb looks at abiogenesis, the creation of life from non-life. He says it's important whether or not a planet has the right conditions. Webb points out that scientists seem puzzled by the process it would take for matter to make the transition from dead rocks in the vacuum of space to basic living organisms such as microbes and bacteria. As Webb sees it, the raw materials are out there, and maybe someday scientists will figure out how they mix together in a meaningful way.
For me, the silence of the universe is shouting, we're the creatures who got lucky. All barriers are behind us.
I would personally say that life is the byproduct of chemistry and physics, and that one allows for the other. Just as physics is a predictable field of study, chemistry also works off a recorded periodic table of the elements. Atheist scientist Richard Dawkins has been seen quoting scientist Albert Einstein, who once asked if God had a choice in creating the universe, meaning the needed time and materials are clearly available. In a YouTube presentation titled How Did Life Come Into Being by Socrates in the City, theist Eric Metexas and scientist Dr. James Torr discuss the latest research into the origin of life. Metexas says this is such a fundamental question because we can get into debates over all areas of science, but the origin of life and the driving forces behind it are more of a mystery at this time.
The reason I ended up writing my book Is Atheism Dead is because when we had that conversation about the origin of life, I was so astonished. I thought, nobody talks about this. So let's talk about this.
So this part's a little tough. Dr. Torr is not an atheist. He is an old Earth creationist with over 700 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and he has academically honest insight into origin of life research. Torr says that scientists are clueless on the origin of life, as lab experiments are currently unable to recreate the conditions that would have been present on the early Earth, and have those conditions produce the basic molecules needed for life. These basic molecules are carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and then proteins. Torr argues that as the early Earth began to cool, basic signs of life began to emerge, quote, shortly after. He challenges the idea that life began in a pond or a primordial soup, as many scientists argue.
That's exactly right, because even if you could make all the 4 classes of chemicals in a prebiotically relevant manner, you don't know how to polymerize them, build them into the higher structures, and then assemble them into the workings of a cell. We have no idea. And none of these men and women that work in that area would say that they could do that.
In a YouTube presentation on New Theories on the Origin of Life by the Aspen Institute, Dr. Eric Smith goes into depth on how he believes the driving force behind the origin of life deals with energy transfers between planetary ecosystems. And this involves the sun, the planets in our solar system, the relationship between the Earth and our moon, and how it shapes life here on Earth.
What I want to argue to you tonight is that the conceptual gap between the non-living world and the living world is not real, or it's not where we have tried to place it in the past. The non-living world is very active. It's richly structured in its activity, and the biosphere, from the beginning all the way to the present, is embedded in detail in the structure of that chemical activity of the rest of the planet. We haven't recognized the connections because our ways of looking have been too small, or they've been too short-term. They've been on the scale of a human life, or maybe we've looked in the wrong places. But particularly in the last 30 years, things that we've learned in a variety of different disciplines are changing the way we ask those questions, and those are the things that cause us to reevaluate what we think the nature of life is and what we're trying to explain.
Basically, each element fosters the growth of other elements. In a YouTube presentation on how an obscure biochemical paradox may explain why we can't find alien life, creator Anton Petrov looks back to his biology degree as he discusses the Levinthal's paradox, which proposes that life might be more rare than we think, as chains of amino acids must fold in a certain way in order to create a functioning protein. You'll remember, amino acids are one of the key products of life. As Petrov says, there are an infinite number of said combinations for how these could fold, and that the simple primary structure will then fold into a secondary structure, and these will fold into a tertiary or third structure. The proteins must take on a functional shape, and the human body has many active proteins.
But how they form into this shape is a question that we currently cannot answer.
Petrov says this is one of the biggest mysteries in biochemistry, as somehow nature found a way to create functioning proteins in a relatively short amount of time.
And so if you have all these chains of different amino acids and they start folding one after another, if they start trying all these combinations, even if they do this really fast, according to the paradox, it would actually take them longer than the age of the entire universe to fold just one single protein.
Further, Petrov adds that this can only occur under specific pH levels at a specific temperature, and then often under specific light conditions as well. Petrov goes on to talk about about computer AI that has become proficient at predicting folding rates, but he says scientists are still trying to figure out how nature is able to do it. Petrov then concludes that the folding process seems to work well on planet Earth at least, and possibly other planets in the universe. So as we go and we reflect on all this, we consider how there are subjects scientists are not really confident in right now, but may learn more about in the future. As atheist Jerry Coyne covers in a Darwin Day lecture, science and atheism will always go hand in hand, as atheists will continue to search for objective truth. As Coyne says, the majority of Americans do not feel comfortable with a naturalistic explanation of events due to strong ties to their religious beliefs. Atheists like Coyne and Dawkins would say their main goal is to separate people from their God belief so that they can become more accepting of science. As atheist scientist Lawrence Krauss would say in one of his lectures,
Richard Feynman used to say that understanding how a rainbow worked did not make the rainbow less wonderful. In fact, it made it more wonderful. And the amazing facets of what we now understand to be the true origin story really dwarf, in my opinion, the Adam and Eve story. And I think what science should be doing to present itself as not a threat, but in fact something that helps raise the human spirit, is to say, with our brains, we've recognized these remarkable facets of the universe, and understanding the universe to be so remarkable did not diminish it.
We shouldn't settle for easy answers. We shouldn't give up. We should continue to search for scientific truth.